So spirituality, again, is ultimately the whole thing. All the teachings are ways of engendering a surrendering of self, whether that surrendering is a spontaneous grace or sometimes it's a very conscious act of letting go. But however it comes about, that's the groundwork, that's the overall orientation of spirituality. Now, when you forget that, as soon as you forget that, then you think that spirituality is meant to serve you. That it's actually your spiritual life is there simply to make you happier, you feel better, it's there to please you. And as I said, even that can take you quite a ways spiritually, but it has a limitation to it. At some point, everybody that embarks on a serious path of spiritual awakening will come to a point of reckoning. They will come to sort of a fork in the road, you might say. And at that fork in the road, you will come to the point where desire, grasping, and wanting, and trying to avoid and push away, that those energies can take you only so far. You get to a point in the fork in the road, and you either change your orientation or your spiritual life actually stalls out. That's what happens, because once that energy of ego has taken you as far as it can take you, either you have to transfer to a different orientation or your spiritual life will stall out. No matter how hard you work at it, you may still be engaged in a spiritual life and you may still be engaged quite actively, but you'll start to feel like you're spinning your wheels, like you're not getting anywhere. And usually a big part of that is because you haven't recognized the necessity of changing your basic orientation about what your spiritual life is all about. Again, the orientation moves as we get more mature from what we can get from the realm of spirit to what we can give to the realm of spirit. How much of ourselves we can give. How much of ourselves we can let go. It's all a way that we're letting go of our separation. We're letting go of our separateness. We're letting go of what creates separateness, what keeps manufacturing separateness. And so this orientation of starting to realize what spirituality is really about becomes very important the farther you go. The farther you go. Because usually moments of grace, moments of spiritual awakening will in and of themselves not be enough. They can be very powerful and very transformative, but in and of themselves, for most people, they're not powerful enough. There's something that is required of oneself, and which is to start to willingly let go of yourself in all the ways that you create self, ideas, opinions, emotional hang-ups. We could go on and on and on of all the ways we hold on to self, but it's the orientation that's really the most important thing. It's understanding this groundwork of what spirituality is really about. And for a while, what I'm talking about for some people may sound like theory. It may sound like something that it's hard for them to touch upon, especially when it comes to, well, what's the experience of myself starting to fall away? But for someone whose self has started to fall away, you have a very visceral sense of what this means, a very visceral, in many ways concrete sense of what it's like to have self start to fall away. The energy of self, the orientation of self. Now, beyond ego, when we get into the range of higher self becomes a very transparent kind of self. The higher self is so transparent that it seems as though it's not even there at all. It's almost looking through like looking through a plane of glass that's perfectly clean. It seems like there's no self there at all. When we come into real union, when we come into the perception of oneness, usually this is higher self stuff. Union, oneness, to see the unity of all things and all creatures, to see the divine in and as everything. This is the realization of higher self. Now, in non-dual spirituality, we often talk of, there's not really a self, that the self is a fiction, the self is something that is manufactured in thought, in memory, and in the basic orientation of our energy. Like I said, self is a type of will to grasp, to push away. But if we only think of self as an illusion, then even though self is ultimately illusion, it's illusion because it's not permanent, because it's not everlasting, and it's also an illusion because when we look into everything that we think has self-nature, what we see that all the components of self don't actually have self in them. When you really start to look at everything that you think has self-nature, has you-nature in it. That's what I mean by self-nature, you, right? That seems to confirm you. Whether it's a thought, an idea, a belief, an emotion, or simply an energy, a type of energy, that all these really don't have self in them. But if we simply say there is no self, then we often miss something very, very important. That even though the self doesn't have ultimate existence, even though it's not our ultimate nature, that does not mean that the activity of this self, illusory or otherwise, does not continue, does not happen, does not have a great effect on one. So, for most people, it's not good enough just to say or even point out that our idea of ourself, our notion of ourself is an illusion, because self is something that's even deeper than simply our ideas and our notions, even our sense of self. Self is that it's actually a movement of consciousness that is constantly referring back to what you might call your internal life. It's self that has an internal life. And by internal life, I mean when we go inside and we look at all that realm of experiences, both good and bad, and love and hate and craving and resistance, and all this internal life, including the internal spiritual experiences, all the internal spiritual experiences, the moments of grace, all of that whole eternal life, that life, that movement is what self is turning us, like consciousness is doing a U-turn and referring back to this inner life. That inner life, that is what self is. That is self. And as I say, lower self can be quite chaotic, very egoically oriented towards power and will and resistance and craving. But also self has this high nature, this very, very, where it's very transparent, almost seems like it's not there at all. It's a realm in which higher self can experience itself as unified with all things, seeing the divine in all things. And this is a very, as I said, transparent and transcendent sense of being. You might say it's sort of a universal sense of I am, where everything partakes of this I amness, of this sacredness, of this divinity. But all these are, in some sense of the word, experiences that we have.